Hey, what's up guys? It's Jack and welcome back to another video, and today we are going to be talking about Primal Rage. And more importantly, we're going to be giving our flowers to Primal Rage because even though this game was released 31 years ago, my goodness, time goes by quick. Even though this game released 31 years ago, quite frankly, it was a game that ended up being a gem. It was also underrated. However, a lot like another game that actually managed to survive time, and that game being Killer Instinct, that ended up getting revived about 13 years or so later. Actually, no. 18 years later or so after its original release. Primal Rage never really got that, but it is just as worthy. And quite frankly, it deserved better. And quite frankly, it also just got severely mistreated. And I'm going to go into that in a little bit here, because even though I was a kid in the arcade that got to fully immerse himself in Primal Rage in an arcade cabinet that was actually quite much larger than your regular arcade cabinet, it had the big screen in front and everything. The people at the arcade literally put that game front and center in terms of where the rest of the arcade was, so you literally couldn't miss it. And quite frankly, at first glance, this game was basically Mortal Kombat but with dinosaurs and giant apes and whatnot, right? So that's what it was at first glance. However, there was a little bit more to it than that, and quite frankly, this game absolutely managed to get the most out of whatever was in the tank, because when you think about it, there were only 7 characters, right? And the way the game would control would be a little bit different than some other fighters in terms of how you would execute moves. So at the same time, they had to cater obviously to your new players, and of course they also had to cater to players so that way there would always be a skill gap as well, because just like anything else, you know, if you're just spending more time doing something, you're gonna get better at it, so there has to be a skill gap, etc., etc. So now obviously with Primal Rage, one of the first things that you'll notice if you actually do pay a little bit of attention is that the colors are actually quite vibrant and the visuals are actually quite good. Now remember, this game did release 31 years ago, so quite frankly, I know and understand to where maybe compared to today's graphics, it's nothing. But if you were around at that time, whether you were around my age, which was 9 or 10 at the time, or whether you were actually I was 10 on my way to 11 actually, or whether you were a little bit older or whatnot, if you saw Primal Rage, there was no way in the world that you couldn't say that the game wasn't unique, right? And the visuals and the vibrant colors were something that definitely helped. And of course, the similarities with Mortal Kombat, but yet vast differences at the same time, that's pretty much the combination of things that made the game unique in and of itself. So now, obviously, the 7 characters that were playable were dinosaurs or giant apes or lizards or whatnot, and each one of them had their own unique movements and combination of movements, and they also had finishers as well. And quite frankly, there was no final boss. At the very end, you fought pretty much, if I am not mistaken, you pretty much fought, I believe it was like all the dinosaurs, kind of like a big exhibition or whatnot. And that's basically how it would work, if I'm not mistaken. And the cool thing about the entirety of Primal Rage is the fact that you could also, like, if there were any humans that were really tiny in size, right, that you would see them, you know, come up really close to you, you could pretty much walk up to them and press a specific type of input, and you could swipe that human and eat them right there on the fly, giving you some health. You also couldn't really repeat a move way too much, because if you did, there would be a sign that would come up that would break the combo, and it would basically be a big piece of cheese with, with a red line through it that basically says no cheese. You can't cheese this. You know what I mean? You could, so that was the game's way of keeping you from performing an unstoppable combo over and over and over again. But with that being said, from a gameplay perspective, the way Primal Rage was unique was that it only had 4 buttons, right? Numbered 1, 2, 3, and 4. And remember, this was back in 1994, so usually numbers wouldn't be the input names, so to speak. You know, there would be like a high punch or a heavy punch or a low punch or a weak punch, light, medium, heavy. That's basically how it was back in the day, right? But numbers were something of a rarity. So Primal Rage actually took the numbers game, which some fighters like Mortal Kombat are doing today, which they weren't doing back then. And that's how they were to do that. That's how they labeled their attacks, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And there was no block button, right? So because there were no 5 or 6 buttons that you had to choose from, it made it a little bit more easily accessible to the newer person that played the game, that wanted to give it a shot. And at the same time, like a lot of the classic fighting games, except for Mortal Kombat at the time, because Mortal Kombat used a block button, the way Primal Rage would do it was similar to other fighting games, to where you just had to hold back in order to block. Right? Okay, but beyond that, it actually did the actual reverse of how other fighting games would execute their moves. For instance, you had to hold down, let's say, 1 or 2 buttons. Usually it was 2. You had to hold down 2 buttons, and then you had to do a certain movement, whether it was a half circle or a quarter circle or something else, with the joystick, and then that character would perform a specific type of move, or a special move, so to speak, right? So basically, the final input before the move was executed would be done by the joystick and not the button. Whereas with a game like, let's say, Street Fighter 2, you would do, like, let's say, a quarter circle or half a circle forward and press a button, right, in order for that to be the final input for the execution of that special move to happen, right? So it was actually the reverse, or vice versa, or the opposite of what other fighting games did at the time, which made Primal Rage actually quite unique. And I remember I've done some research on this game very recently. I've watched a few videos and stuff like that, and I found out things that I never found out before. And the game testers really were like some of the best players out there at the time that played this game and were very, very familiar with fighting games. And they really made this game, helped make the game a lot more in-depth than it would be on the surface. And the controls, in terms of how they decided to make those work, was a big, big part of that. And of course, how they would, you know, stop things from being too cheesy. And of course, the one thing that the game actually did do right, especially since it released in 1994, which was 2 years after the original Mortal Kombat, which was 1 year before Mortal Kombat 3. And plus, you had Killer Instinct coming out in 1995. Was it 95 or 94? I don't remember. But around that same time, when all those games were out, you know, it really did embrace the violence and the gore, but it did it in its own unique way. It wasn't like nearly as something to be taken seriously or something to look as realistic as a Mortal Kombat, for instance. I mean, hell, even Killer Instinct was definitely a much lighter version or whatnot. But with that being said, Primal Rage did it in its own unique way. And also with the 7 characters that it did have, let's see, I'm trying to remember who all the 7 characters were here by heart. Let's see, you had Talon, which was a velociraptor. You had Vertigo, which was basically like a snake, but that had legs and arms, which was pretty cool too. Let's see, you also had Armadon, which was basically like a Triceratops, basically, but on roids. Let's see, you had Chaos, right? You had, who was an ape, a giant ape, but smaller than the other giant ape, which was Blizzard, which held the power of ice. And Chaos was basically like just a disgusting ape, which he would puke on you. One of his fatalities, he would pee on you, and you'd melt into a skeleton or whatnot. So, and then you had the 2 T-Rexes, one smaller, one large. You had a red one named Diablo, and then the yellow with blue stripes that would be named Sauron, which was the larger one of the 2. So these were basically your characters that were in the game. And Mortal Kombat 1 had 7 characters, and Primal Rage also had 7 characters, but they certainly made the most of them, for sure. Every single character, despite the fact that some of them definitely looked a lot like the other when it came to the 2 T-Rexes, the smaller one and the bigger one, and of course the 2 apes, the smaller one and the bigger one, they played quite differently. And I've seen people that were really good with Vertigo, and I've seen a lot of people that were really good with Blizzard. Blizzard was the one that I'd see the most, but my main character was actually Talon. I like Talon quite a bit. But with that being said, every single character had their own, you know, way of, not just the way they, what their special moves were, but of course they had their finishers. And despite the fact that there were so many similarities, especially when it comes to, you know, the way they did the 3D animations and stuff like that, like it was man, it was just every character, even though they were immensely similar in terms of how they would play in accordance with their moves and everything like that, was very unique. And again, it was a game that came out that you could tell had potential, but you could also tell that it seems like there was a little bit more that they could have done with it, but they just never really got there. And quite frankly, over the last few years, excuse me, I would find out that Primal Rage actually ended up having a sequel that never got released. However, the Galloping Ghost Arcade in Chicago actually does have a very playable cabinet of Primal Rage 2, and it was quite different than the first one, but the dinosaurs and the apes and all the characters from the first game did reprise their appearance. However, it was done a little bit differently this time. There were giant humans that you could play as well, plus there were super moves into where the humans would turn into those dinosaurs that you were familiar with the first game or whatnot. It was different, but from a gameplay perspective, Primal Rage 2 actually played better, like significantly better than the first one. It was smoother, and from a gameplay perspective, it was just an overall better fighting game, but it never really got to see the light of day, which was a really big heartbreaker, especially for the developers that have put in so much time, heart, blood, sweat, and tears into the game. But what's even worse is that Midway, the guys who owned Mortal Kombat at the time, they pretty much pulled a WWE and bought their competition. So Primal Rage ended up being owned by them, and long story short, they really didn't do much with it, and if anything at all. And that's pretty much a bummer. And fun fact, I owned a Sega Saturn, and I actually had the Saturn version of Primal Rage, which was a pretty close to an arcade version of it, and I absolutely loved it. I adored it. And back then, that's when I played fighting games more than anything else. So your Street Fighters, your Mortal Kombats, your Killer Instincts, your Primal Rage, like all those games, like that was what I was into more than anything else at the time. I played other games, but fighting games were like my main area that really just caught my attention above everything else at that time. And as you guys know, the 1990s were definitely peak fighting time for games, especially in the arcades, where arcades were in their prime at the time. And it was really, really a blessing. And it really sucks that Primal Rage just never really got to reach its full potential. And there is still a part of me, a piece of me, a big piece of me actually, that hopes that at some point in time, some way, somehow, I'm not sure, and I don't care how it has to be done, but I would really love Primal Rage to get resurrected in a way that Killer Instinct did, even if it starts slow, because Killer Instinct ended up starting slow and it became one of the greatest fighting games ever made, period, from a mechanical perspective, the graphics, the content, and everything else like that. It started out really, really slow, but what made that game possible for it to come back was the fact that people were still passionate about it. And when the internet came out in the late 90s, people were talking about it on forums left and right. People, I guess when YouTube came around, people were making YouTube videos about it. And lo and behold, in 2013, that game ended up coming to fruition. And to this day, it's still loved and adored and played very well to this day. And I would love to see some similar type of love being given to Primal Rage, man, especially if you also introduce other new characters. Now, obviously, you've got to bring the original roster back, right? But I'm pretty sure, especially with today's technology and today's imagination and how far we've come in fighting games and just gaming in general, that it is certainly possible to make a Primal Rage all over again. Just call it Primal Rage, right? And introduce new characters, new dinosaurs and stuff like that. I mean, hell, we can take inspiration from Jurassic Park. You know what I mean? So I think it would be awesome if that were to happen. But Primal Rage, unfortunately, as of right now, as far as I know and as far as I understand, is a game that it's gone, unfortunately, but it's certainly not forgotten. And who knows? Maybe in a certain amount of time, maybe if other content creators or people on the internet just start spreading the word left and right or something like that, maybe we can resurrect this game. But with that being said, I would like to know in the comments section down below, what does this game mean to you? From a fighting game perspective, from a gameplay perspective, from a nostalgia perspective? In my opinion, it is a lost and forgotten gem that just everybody has forgotten about, or should I say the vast, vast, vast majority of gamers that have forgotten about. However, when it is brought up, it brings up a lot of nostalgia, a lot of great memories. And let's not forget the fact that Primal Rage is one of those games that is very, very much heavily respected in nostalgia and rooted deeply in nostalgia as well. Because when the game did come out, and if you were there like I was at age 10 going on 11, or around that time to where you were, you know, at a certain point to where you could understand what it was, you know, it's something that is still appreciated to this day. And I'm sure that there are a good amount of fans out there that would love to see the game be given some true love and to get resurrected again. But with that being said, I really like to know in the comment section what your thoughts are on that. And with that being said, I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time to watch and or listen. I'm really looking forward to reading your comments in the comment section about this. And I'll catch you guys on the next one.